The Haunted Locker Mystery, The Ghost of Locker 13, revealed. Chapter 1, The New Kid. Eli Martinez stared out the car window as the unfamiliar streets of his new town blurred past. Harrington was quiet, too quiet for his liking. He missed the noise and energy of his old neighborhood, buzzing sounds of the city, the constant movement of people. Here it felt like everything had slowed to a crawl. He swallowed hard, gripping his backpack a little tighter. "This is it," his mom said with a forced smile as they pulled up in front of Harrington Middle School. "You'll do great, Eli. Just be yourself." Eli nodded, though he didn't feel confident at all. New school, new people, new everything. He was determined to make it work. New start, new me, he told himself, trying to ignore the nervous knots twisting in his stomach. The building loomed large, its brick walls casting long shadows over the empty courtyard. He could already hear the chatter of students inside as he walked up to the main entrance. Taking a deep breath, Eli stepped through the doors. The main office was bustling with activity, but the secretary barely looked up when he approached the counter. "Name?" she asked briskly, tapping away at her keyboard. "Eli Martinez," he said, his voice cracking slightly. Cleared his throat, trying to sound more confident. After a few moments, she handed him a schedule and a small slip of paper. "Here's your locker number, 13. Down the hall, last one on the right." Eli mumbled a quick thanks and stepped into the hallway, scanning the rows of lockers lining the walls. The school had that familiar scent: floor cleaner, old books, and the faint mustiness of too many bodies crammed together for too long. Kids milled about, talking, laughing, moving in groups. He felt a pang of loneliness, but shook it off. The day was the day he'd make some friends. As he neared the end of the corridor, his eyes landed on his assigned locker. Locker number 13. Unlike the others, which were painted a dull blue, this one had a worn-out, rusty appearance, like it hadn't been touched in years. The metal was chipped, and the number 13 was barely visible under layers of grime. For some reason, it looked colder, almost like a dark cloud hung over it. Eli reached for the handle, his hand hesitating in midair. A group of students passed behind him, their whispers catching his attention. "Locker 13? Seriously? Poor guy, he's done for." "What?" Eli turned, raising an eyebrow at their retreating backs. "Hey, what's that supposed to mean?" he called, but they just giggled and disappeared around the corner. Shaking off the weird vibe, Eli shrugged and pulled the locker open. The hinges groaned, as if the door hadn't moved in ages. Inside, it was surprisingly clean, empty, save for a couple of dust bunnies in the corners. But then something else caught his attention. Faint noise. Breathing. Eli stiffened. At first, he thought it was just his imagination playing tricks on him. But the soft, rhythmic sound was unmistakable, like someone exhaling right over his shoulder. He whipped around, heart pounding, expecting to find someone behind him. But the hallway was empty. His pulse quickened. He looked back into the locker, half expecting to find something, or someone lurking inside. Nothing. Just shadows and a slight chill that made the hair on his arms stand on end. "Great. First day, and I'm already losing it," Eli muttered under his breath, slamming the locker shut a little harder than necessary. But as he walked away, the air still felt heavy around him, like the building itself was watching, waiting. And though he tried to push the feeling aside, the faint echo of that breathing lingered in his ears long after he'd turned the corner. Chapter 2, Whispers, The Warning. Eli's first few days at Harrington Middle School didn't exactly go as planned. He had hoped to fly under the radar, maybe make a friend or two, but instead, his life had taken a strange turn. It started small, little things he could almost shrug off. His math textbook disappeared from his backpack, only to show up 2 periods later in a completely different classroom. Favorite pen? The one he always kept in his jacket pocket, was gone when he reached for it, only to be found later, jammed inside locker 13, without him ever opening it. But it wasn't just the missing items that unsettled him, it was the notes. First one appeared a couple of days after his initial encounter with the locker. Eli opened it, expecting to find his science book, but instead, a scrap of paper fluttered to the floor. Scrawled in jagged handwriting, the words sent a chill down his spine. "Get out while you can." Eli stared at the note, unsure if it was some kind of prank or if it meant something darker. He tried to laugh it off, stuffing it into his pocket, but he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that followed him the rest of the day. By the end of the week, his locker had been a constant source of anxiety. Almost every time he opened it, there was another message, short, cryptic, and always menacing. "You're not safe. Too late for you." When he mentioned it to Lucas, his only real friend at school so far, Lucas just gave him a nervous smile and quickly changed the subject. The rest of his classmates, those who usually shot him casual glances in the hallways, now avoided eye contact altogether. It was like they knew something but were too afraid to say anything. Eli began to feel like an outsider, more isolated than ever before. One afternoon, as he was sitting alone at lunch, picking at his sandwich, a girl he recognized from homeroom slid into the seat across from him. She didn't say anything at first, just stared down at the table. Eli glanced up, puzzled. Megan, right?" he asked, remembering her name from roll call. She nodded, but still didn't meet his eyes. "What's up?" "I heard about your locker," he said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Locker 13. Eli's stomach tightened. He hadn't mentioned the weird things to anyone other than Lucas. So how did she know? What about it? Megan finally looked up, and her pale blue eyes were filled with something that looked a lot like fear. "You have to stay away from it," she said, her voice trembling. "No one who's ever had that locker comes back." Eli raised an eyebrow. "What are you talking about?" She leaned in closer, her voice dropping even lower. "It's cursed. I know it sounds crazy, but it's true. The last kid who had it, he disappeared. Just like the one before him, and the one before that." She paused, glancing around nervously, as if afraid someone was listening. "They don't want us to talk about it, but everyone knows." Eli sat back, trying to process what she was saying. Disappearing kids? Purses? It all sounded ridiculous, like something out of a ghost story. But Megan's expression was deadly serious. "Look," he continued, her hands shaking slightly as she spoke. "My brother, he had that locker 2 years ago. He went missing, and no one ever found him. The school told us it was just an accident, but I know it's not. He started getting those notes too, just like you." Eli's heart raced, but he tried to keep his voice steady. "And you think the locker is, what, haunted?" Megan bit her lip and nodded. "I don't know exactly what it is, but it's not normal. Whatever's in there, it's dangerous. You have to stop using it, Eli. Don't make the same mistake they did." Her words sent a shiver through him, but despite the fear gnawing at his insides, Eli felt something else. Curiosity. He didn't want to admit it, but the idea of the locker having some dark secret made his skin tingle with excitement. It was terrifying, sure, but also intriguing. He'd always been the kind of kid who wanted to know the truth, no matter how unsettling it might be. "What if I want to figure out what's really going on?" Eli asked, his voice quiet but bam. Megan's eyes widened and she shook her head quickly. "No, you don't. You don't want to dig into this. The more you know, the worse it gets." Eli frowned, not entirely convinced. "What if there's something else to it? Something nobody's figured out yet?" Megan stood abruptly, her face pale. "Please, Eli, I'm telling you this because I don't want anything bad to happen to you. Stay away from locker 13. Without waiting for a response, she hurried out of the cafeteria, leaving Eli alone with his thoughts. As he sat there, staring at his half-eaten sandwich, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to stay away. He couldn't. The mystery of locker 13 had hooked him, and no amount of warnings could keep him from finding out the truth, even if it was the last thing he did. Chapter 3. Digging into the mystery. Eli couldn't get Megan's warning out of his head. The more he thought about it, the more he knew he had to uncover the truth. Fear gripped him. Curiosity pushed him forward. By the following day, he had made up his mind. He wasn't going to do this alone, though. If anyone could help, it was Lucas. They sat in the corner of the cafeteria, huddled over their lunches, Eli whispering his plan. Lucas wasn't easily convinced. "I dunno, man," Lucas muttered, his eyes flicking nervously toward locker 13 at the end of the hallway. "I've heard stories about that locker. Kids say it's bad luck. Why dig around and make things worse?" Eli leaned in closer. "That's the point. There's something going on, and it's been happening for years. Look, if you're too scared, I get it, but I have to figure this out." Lucas hesitated, chewing on his lower lip. After a long pause, he sighed and nodded. Okay, but if this locker eats us alive or something, I'm blaming you. That afternoon, when the school emptied out and the hallways echoed with silence, Eli and Lucas slipped into the school library. The place smelled of dust and old paper, the tall shelves casting eerie shadows in the dim light. They headed straight for the archives, where old yearbooks and newspapers were stored. Eli flipped through pages, his fingers trembling slightly as he came across an old headline. Student vanishes without a trace, Locker 13 connection? He nudged Lucas, who leaned over his shoulder to read. B? Eli whispered. It's all here. These students went missing, one after another, and they all had the same locker. They found more clippings, stories dating back decades. Each article described a student who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Common thread? Every one of them had been assigned Locker 13 before they vanished. Eli's pulse quickened with each story. Whatever was going on, it had been happening for a long time. They weren't alone in their search for answers. The creak of the library door startled them. Miss Harper, the history teacher, stood in the doorway, her eyes narrowing suspiciously. What are you boys doing here? Eli swallowed hard. Nothing, Miss Harper. Just working on a history project. Miss Harper stepped closer, her expression softening. History project, huh? She glanced down at the newspapers scattered across the table, her gaze lingering on the old headlines. About Locker 13, I assume? Lucas shifted uncomfortably in his seat. You know about it? Miss Harper sighed, pulling up a chair and sitting across from them. Her face looked tired, as if she carried the weight of an old unspeakable secret. I've worked here a long time, she began quietly, and the stories about Locker 13, they aren't just rumors. A boy named Logan disappeared decades ago. It happened right here in this school. Eli leaned forward, heart racing. What happened to him? She hesitated, as if deciding how much to reveal. Logan was a quiet kid, kept to himself. Some older students played a prank on him. They locked him inside that very locker, thinking it was just a joke. But when they came back to let him out, he was gone. No one ever saw him again. Lucas shuddered. And you think his spirit is haunting the locker? Miss Harper didn't answer immediately. She stared off, her eyes distant. Some people believe Logan never left. Others say it's just coincidence. But every student who's had that locker since, well, you've read the articles. They all vanished. That locker? It's cursed. The words hung in the air, cold and heavy. Miss Harper's warning lingered in Eli's mind as they left the library. Lucas seemed eager to leave the school, but Eli lingered, glancing back at Locker 13 at the end of the hallway. Its metal surface looked more menacing than before. The shadows around it seemed to stretch longer, darker. I don't like this, Eli, Lucas said, breaking the silence. Maybe we should just forget it. Pretend none of this ever happened. But Eli wasn't ready to let it go. Something about the locker, about Logan's story, gnawed at him, refusing to let him walk away. Just go, Eli muttered. I'll catch up in a minute. Lucas gave him a wary glance but nodded, hurrying down the hall. Eli turned back to Locker 13. The air around it felt colder than the rest of the hallway. A frigid draft was seeping from the cracks. His hand hovered over the lock, its heart pounding in his chest. Then, without warning, the whispers started again. They were louder this time, raspy and frantic, like someone trying to speak from deep within the metal confines. Eli froze, his breath catching in his throat. Words were unintelligible, but the urgency was unmistakable. Before he could react, the locker door creaked open on its own. Eli stumbled back as a blast of freezing air rushed out, hitting him with the force of a winter storm. His feet slipped on the tile floor, and he fell hard, his backpack spilling open beside him. From the locker, the whispers grew louder, swirling around him, filling the hallway with an eerie echo. Eli scrambled to his feet, his heart racing as the locker door slammed shut with a deafening bang. He stood there, staring at the locker, the cold seeping into his bones. Whatever was in there, it wasn't just a ghost story. It was real, and it wasn't going to let him go that easily. Chapter 4. The Vanishing. Eli arrived at school the next morning with a sinking feeling in his gut. Something about the previous day, about the way the locker had swung open on its own, the whispers, freezing cold, left him uneasy. Lucas had told him to drop the whole thing, but Eli knew it wasn't over. Whatever was inside locker 13 wasn't done with him yet. As he walked down the hallway, a knot of anxiety twisted tighter in his stomach. He scanned the rows of students at their lockers, but Lucas wasn't among them. Eli frowned. Wasn't like Lucas to be late. By lunchtime, worry gnawed at him. Lucas was still missing. His seat in class had remained empty, and no one had seen him since yesterday afternoon. Eli asked around, but no one had any answer. Teachers seemed just as clueless. After school, Eli went to their usual meeting spot near the bike rack. But again, Lucas was a no-show. That's when it hit him. Lucas hadn't just skipped school. He had disappeared. Eli's chest tightened. His friend wouldn't just vanish. And then his mind flashed back to the stories he'd read. Articles about students who had used locker 13 before. They had all disappeared, just like Lucas. Eli raced down the hall, barely aware of the other students bustling around him. His feet skidded to a stop in front of Lucas's locker. It was still there, untouched. His backpack hung on the hook inside, and his books were stacked neatly on the bottom shelf, as if he had planned to come back. But Lucas hadn't returned. Eli stood frozen, staring at the open locker. His friend had been taken. Just then, a quiet voice spoke from behind him. "He's gone, isn't he?" Eli spun around and found Megan standing there, her eyes wide with concern. She wasn't looking at him. Her gaze was fixed on locker 13, just a few feet away. Eli swallowed hard, the weight of dread settling over him like a heavy blanket. "Lucas," Eli whispered, voice barely audible. "He's missing. I think the locker, it's cursed." Megan interrupted, her tone urgent. "I tried to warn you, Eli. Logan's spirit is trapped in that locker, and anyone who tries to mess with it disappears." Eli clenched his fists, fighting back the rising panic. Why? Why does he take people?" Megan's face grew pale, her voice trembling as she spoke. Logan was angry, furious. When those kids locked him inside as a prank, he never forgave them. They found his body later, but not before he made a promise. He swore he'd get revenge. Now, he's stuck between this world and the next, taking anyone who dares disturb his locker. Eli's blood ran cold. "But I didn't do anything. I didn't even know about him." Megan's eyes darkened. "You opened the locker. You let him out." Chill crept up Eli's spine. The whispers, the cold blast of air. He had let Logan's spirit loose, and now his friend was gone because of it. Before he could respond, Megan leaned in, her voice low. "You need to stay away from that locker, Eli. Logan's not done. He's angry, and if you keep messing with it, you'll be next." Eli wanted to listen. Every instinct told him to run, to leave the cursed locker behind and never look back. But he couldn't. Lucas was his friend, and if Logan had taken him, Eli was the only one who could help. "I can't just leave him," Eli said, his voice firm. "Lucas is still out there, and I'm going to find him." Megan shook her head. "Don't be stupid, Eli. This isn't some game. You keep poking around, Logan will come for you too." But Eli had already made up his mind. He wasn't going to abandon his friend. Later that day, after the final bell rang and the school emptied, Eli returned to locker 13. His heart pounded as he approached, the air around him growing colder with every step. The locker seemed to loom larger, its rusty surface almost pulsing with energy. With trembling hands, he opened the locker door. At first, nothing happened. The inside looked exactly as it had the day before, empty, dark, and cold. But then a gust of icy air swept over him, and Eli felt it again. The whispers. They swirled around him, growing louder and more insistent, like they were trying to pull him in. Then he saw it. A note, crumpled and yellowed, lying at the bottom of the locker. Eli's fingers shook as he picked it up. The paper was fragile, like it had been there for decades, and the writing was jagged, shaky, almost as if it had been scrawled in a moment of panic. "You're next." The words sent a shock through Eli's body, and he dropped the note, heart pounding in his ears. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't just some strange coincidence. Whatever was haunting this locker wanted him next. Eli stumbled back, slamming the locker shut. His breath came in ragged gasps, and fear clawed at his chest. He had no doubt now. Lucas was gone, taken by whatever force lived inside that cursed locker, and now it was coming for him. But Eli wasn't ready to give up. Couldn't let Lucas become another name on a long list of missing students. He had to find a way to stop Logan's spirit, once and for all, for he vanished too. Chapter 5. The Ghost of Logan. Eli stood in front of locker 13, his heart pounding in his chest. The hallway was eerily quiet after school hours, the usual hustle of students replaced by an unsettling stillness. Eli's fingers trembled as he reached for the lock, his mind racing with the stories he'd uncovered. He knew this was his last chance to stop whatever dark force lurked within. Lucas's fate, and his own, depended on it. Taking a deep breath, Eli spun the dial and opened the door. Icy gust hit him immediately, stronger than ever. This time, Eli didn't back away. He braced himself, eyes narrowing as the cold air swirled around him. Then, from the shadows within the locker, a figure began to take shape. First, it was just a faint outline, barely visible. But slowly the figure solidified. Pale boy stepped forward, clothes tattered and from another time his skin almost translucent. His eyes were hollow, dark circles surrounding them, and his lips curled into a twisted, bitter smile. It was Logan. Eli froze, fear creeping up his spine. The ghost's presence was overwhelming, its form flickering like a dying light. Logan's expression was one of sadness, anger, and something far worse, an emptiness that chilled Eli to the bone. "You opened it," Logan's voice echoed through the hallway, soft and distant, like it came from a far-off place. "You let me out." Eli swallowed hard, forcing himself to speak. "I didn't know, Logan. I didn't know about you." Logan's smile faded. He stared at Eli for a long moment as if weighing his words. Then he began to speak, his voice bitter and sorrowful. "I wasn't supposed to die. They did it as a joke, locked me in here, but they never came back. They thought it would be funny, but it wasn't. It wasn't funny at all." Eli's stomach twisted as the pieces of the story fell into place. The bullies, prank that went too far. Logan, trapped in locker 13, alone and afraid, until it was too late. "I was stuck here," Logan continued, his eyes narrowing as memories of the past flooded his mind. "No one came for me, no one helped, so I waited and waited until I couldn't wait anymore." Eli took a step forward, his heart racing. "But why take the others? Lucas didn't do anything to you. None of the others did." Logan's hollow eyes shifted toward him, cold and unfeeling. "Locker keeps them. It holds them here with me. I didn't want to hurt anyone, but it won't let me stop. It's too late now. I'm stuck. They're stuck. Everyone who touches this locker, they're trapped." Eli's mind raced. All those kids who had disappeared, students like Lucas, like the ones Megan had warned him about, they hadn't just vanished. They had been taken by the locker's curse, their spirits imprisoned alongside Logan's. Eli's chest tightened. "Lucas is still here, isn't he?" Logan didn't respond at first, just stared at Eli with those sunken, haunted eyes. Then slowly he nodded. "He's here, but not for long." The air grew colder, and Eli felt a shiver run through him. He wasn't sure how much time he had left to save Lucas. He had to act now. "There has to be a way to end this," Eli said, desperation creeping into his voice. "You don't have to keep them here, Logan. You can let them go. You can end this." Logan's form flickered, his ghostly face tightening with something that looked like pain. "I can't," he whispered. "The locker won't let me. It's not just me anymore. It's something else, something darker. Feeds on us." Eli's heart pounded. "Then let me destroy it." Logan's ghostly figure stiffened. "Destroy it?" His voice wavered, and for the first time, Eli saw something other than anger in his expression. There was fear. Eli nodded. "If I destroy the locker, it can't hurt anyone else. No one will get trapped inside. You can be free, Logan. All of you can." Logan stared at him, silent and still. For a moment, Eli thought he would refuse. But then, Logan's form flickered again, and his voice was softer this time, almost pleading. "You have to burn it," he said. "Set it on fire. That's the only way." Eli's breath caught in his throat. Fire. He wasn't sure if it would work, but it was the only chance he had. The locker had to be destroyed. He had to save Lucas, and he had to stop this curse from claiming anyone else. Logan's hollow eyes fixed on Eli, his twisted smile gone. "Burn it, and then maybe we can all go home." Eli nodded, determination hardening his resolve. He would do it. He would burn the locker and end the nightmare once and for all. There was no other choice. But as he closed the locker door, the whispers rose again, louder and more menacing than ever before. And deep in his chest, Eli couldn't shake the feeling that destroying the locker wouldn't be as easy as it sounded. Chapter 6. Breaking the Curse. Eli stood in front of locker 13, a can of lighter fluid in one hand and matches in the other. The school was empty, silent except for the eerie whispering coming from the locker. It was louder now, more insistent, as if the locker itself was alive and begging to be spared. But Eli wasn't about to back down, not after everything he'd uncovered, not after Lucas had disappeared. His heart raced, the weight of what he was about to do pressing down on him. Destroying the locker wasn't just about ending the curse. It was about releasing everyone who had been trapped by its dark power, including Logan. With shaking hands, Eli poured the lighter fluid over the locker door, soaking the rusted metal. The whispers rose in pitch, swirling around him like an invisible storm. It felt as if the air itself was trying to stop him, pushing him back. But Eli held firm. He flicked the match against the box, watching the flame catch before he tossed it onto the locker. The fire spread quickly, flames licking up the sides of the locker as the whispers turned into a deafening roar. Eli took a step back, his heart pounding in his chest. The heat was intense, and the flames danced wildly, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Then, through the fire, Logan appeared. Ghostly form hovered just outside the blaze, his eyes no longer filled with anger or sorrow. Instead, he looked grateful. Logan's pale face softened, and he gave Eli a small, almost imperceptible nod of thanks. It was as if, for the first time in decades, Logan's spirit had found peace. Eli blinked, and Logan was gone. Flames raged on, consuming the locker entirely. The metal groaned and creaked, and for a moment, Eli worried the fire might spread. But as quickly as the flames had flared up, they began to die down, leaving behind a smoldering pile of twisted, blackened metal. The whispers, once so loud they had seemed to echo through the entire school, faded to nothing. Eli stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, mind racing. Had it worked? Was it really over? As the smoke cleared, Eli heard a faint cough behind him. He spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. Lucas was standing in the hallway, blinking in confusion. His clothes were the same as the day he had disappeared, his face pale but unharmed. Beside him, other students began to appear, just as dazed. They looked around, clearly unsure of where they were or how they had gotten there. "Lucas!" Eli rushed over, grabbing his friend by the shoulders. "You're okay. You're back." Lucas shook his head, still disoriented. What happened? Where did I go?" Eli smiled, relief flooding through him. "It's a long story, but you're safe now. The locker, it's gone." One by one, the other missing students gathered around, murmuring to each other in confusion. None of them seemed to remember what had happened to them, but they were all alive and well. The curse had been lifted. The next day, Eli walked down the hallway, passing by the spot where Locker 13 had once stood. Now it was just an empty space. The locker was gone, as if it had never existed. The school felt different, lighter, as though a dark cloud had finally lifted. Eli couldn't help but smile as he made his way to class. The nightmare was over. Lucas was back. Missing students had returned, and Logan's spirit was finally at rest. As he sat down at his desk, Eli thought about everything he had learned. He realized that standing up to cruelty wasn't just about stopping bullies or breaking curses. It was about facing the things that haunted you, the things that held you back. Sometimes the hardest battle was confronting the past and refusing to let it control your future. As Eli opened his notebook to start a new day, he felt a sense of closure. He had done something no one else had dared to do. He had faced the terror of Locker 13 and broken its hold on the school. The past could finally rest, and the future was his to shape. For the first time since he had transferred to Harrington Middle School, Eli felt like he truly belonged.